Welcome to Yassy, Issapour. She is now an investor through her company, 440 Hertz, and she has over 10 years experience in the investment field and with could be argued many things. So welcome, Yassy.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yes, definitely could be argued many things.
Many
It's, I
things.
guess, how you make up for lack of longevity is breath. But super excited to be here and to talk a little bit about 440 Hertz and kind of maybe the broader investment space.
Yeah. Why don't we start with the name? Because I love the name.
Yes. So 440 Hertz is basically like the standard frequency used as a reference pitch for tuning of musical instruments. And that's the standard tuning pitch for almost all of Western music. It's, the A that sits on the piano above middle C. And so when you go to play as a music ensemble or, whether it's in an orchestra or a band, it's like that A that you tune to. And so everyone is on the same frequency and it provides a like consistent reference point for the musicians and their instruments as well. And so I think anybody who's gone to see a concert, more likely than not, that's like when the first chair violin comes out and plays the tuning A, everyone plays that back, and that's how you know the concert's kind of about to begin. So I kind of liked that name because of my background with music, and I wanted to kind of bring it into the investment world and what we're doing at 440 Hertz, which is really specific to helping like kind of the best scientists and technologists build companies that have a sustainability driven focus. And so 440 Hertz is kind of like the standard for music. And I think that kind of can apply very well to the world of sustainability as well, which is like a global problem, and it's something that is universally recognized. And so that's kind of the genesis of the name there. And the genesis of the business itself is really a result of kind of my experience both in emerging markets as an operator as well as a investor, and kind of as well as having a background in sustainable development and economics, and kind of seeing what in the world is getting funded today from a sustainability perspective. And it obviously is a huge challenge that we all face. But what I found is that some of the best technologies that can solve these really complex problems that we face sit with scientists who might not have like that commercial angle to be able to get things funded and to build a business. And so after spending some time both as an investor and then building a fintech business for the past 6 years, I thought this is kind of like the combination of everything that I love, which is like interesting technology, a problem set that I think is really personal to all of us, and bringing and building together teams and funding. And so that's kind of the background behind 440 Hertz and what we're doing.
And I love the name because it's also music is also the universal language.
Yeah.
So it kind of communicates across all platforms. And why don't we go back a little bit, because I want to talk about sort of your definition of sustainability, what those pillars are, but why don't we talk about, you just got back to New York,
Yes.
living in the UK. So
Um,
why don't we just talk about that for a minute?
yes. So I grew up here in New York, but my family is Persian. And so while I'm like born and raised here, I always kind of had family abroad, and I always wanted to work in less commoditized markets, which are really accessible outside of the US. And so I moved to London after I finished my university degree, and I've spent the past 8 or 9 years there, which has been a really interesting perspective, not just from a work point of view, but also from like a cultural point of view, as being somebody who is, grew up in the US, but has touched on, I would say, like various cultures growing up, and learning how to operate in a work environment, in a professional as well as a personal capacity in not just in London, but then also kind of in Southeast Asia and in Europe and sub-Saharan Africa. And so it's been a very broad and diverse experience. And so to come back to the US is is also an interesting experience for me personally to see kind of like how much I have changed and how I'm now again adapting to a culture that feels quite different, even though I think it's what I'm very used to for the first 21 years of my life.
So, what did you find about the differences when you started the company in the UK and
Oh,
how you had to deal with that?
yeah. So I think there's a lot of cultural differences that exist from like a work perspective, and that starts a lot with um kind of some things that are enshrined in labor laws, and then other things that are just kind of, cultural, where you do get, people really enjoy their time off and their family time. And not to say that people in the US don't, but when you get a lot more of it, I think it creates a different interaction that people have with their work colleagues and their work environment versus in the US, where you just kind of get, the standard 2 weeks a year for most people. And so it creates a very different dynamic for somebody who's used to operating in a more US environment where it's a little bit like, work until it's done and not stop at 5 or 6 p.m. And I'm not saying that the UK doesn't have that, but I think it definitely felt like it was a little bit of a cultural challenge. And then the other thing that I find really interesting working in London is obviously it's not just people who are British who you're working with, but you touch upon a lot of like really top talent from Europe and the rest of the world, because from an immigration perspective, it's slightly easier than the US to go and work in the UK. And then what you find is that everybody pretty much will work and operate in English in the office environment, but there's a lot of like very different, I would say, meanings that come out of people speaking the same language. So, there's like a great chart out there, I think, that is what a British person says and then how it translates to American English. And it's really funny because they'll be like, somebody in the UK could tell you, well, like that's bold. And like as an American, you're like, yeah, like thank you. I'm gonna go after that and like really excited. And that's not necessarily what they mean when they say that's bold. Um, it's not meant in a positive way, as I've learned. So it's an
So
interesting
what? Oh,
dynamic.
so it's not okay. So you're not going to tell us, probably.
Yeah, no, no. If somebody's like, oh, like, well, that's really bold. It's not like that's bold, you should go after that. It's like that's bold, that's fringe, that's crazy. You're wasting your time.
And now you were there through the pandemic and trying to grow that company through lockdowns, right?
Yes.
So what was
Um,
that must have been hard because it's a different culture, really. Even
yeah,
though we speak English, it's a different culture. So how is that trying
definitely.
to manage a team through Zoom or
Yeah. I feel like everybody has these nightmare stories of like how they grew teams during pandemics and how really difficult it was to manage teams remotely. And I think for me, it was actually an interesting period because I had left my last business on, I think I had resigned on like the 6th of March or the 13th of March, 2020. So I had done it really right as the pandemic had started to hit Europe already, and nobody knew what was coming. And I basically effectively started working full time for the business that I co-founded at that point in time. And the other four co-founders were already in the business and working full time for quite some time. And we had two employees in addition to kind of like the founding team. And then obviously very quickly we had to grow the team. And so what's really interesting was hiring people without meeting them and kind of meeting them just on Zoom, right? And so that was like a particular challenge that we faced because we ended up, I think, 4xing our company headcount, or maybe 5x during the pandemic period. And so getting people to work cohesively together who have never worked together as a team was a really difficult challenge. And everyone was based in the UK, but also of, various coming from various cultural backgrounds. So it was a really big challenge for us. And I think a lot of it was done through like just constant communication, via Zoom and via Slack, which I think a lot of people talk about. And then when the restrictions were lifted and it got easier, it was kind of like meeting up with people in person, but we lost a lot of that like organic interaction building as a result, right? So like a tech person couldn't necessarily turn to the subject matter expert really quickly just to have like a 2 second gut check conversation. It was you had to like send a Slack and schedule a meeting. And so I feel like a lot of those knowledge shares just took longer
Yeah.
as a result. And so that was a big challenge that we really faced was like kind of scaling up, but making sure that the knowledge was still spread and shared as it would be if you were in an office environment. And I think that's why a lot of people still have this question around the debate of like work from home versus, going into an office.
Yeah, I think too, the other thing is doing that sort of sanity check with your team when you don't really know them, right? Like,
Yeah.
so, and they're they're culturally, I think, maybe not quite as warm as North Americans as far as touchy-feely, kind of, they're a little bit more standoffish, unless I have that wrong.
Well, it sounds like you have some experience.
Yeah. So I can't imagine. So, I mean, I know what we went through, but I can't imagine what it would be like to be in the UK with new people that you don't know, trying to manage that, doing that mental health check over Zoom in
Yeah.
an environment where they're not oversharers anyway.
Yeah, I think it's really it was really difficult, and I think that was very clear. I think the other thing that was really obvious for me at least was like I wasn't comfortable when we started that in managing people. And that was like a big change that happened that for me was accelerated as a result of this happening during the pandemic. So like right, I was 26, I think, and so I wasn't used, I think all of our team at that point was older than me. And so being able to effectively manage people is not like a skill set that you're taught when you're sitting in the finance world and you're just like your goal is to be like the best and generate the most output. Um, and maybe it's less on that like emotional intelligence side. So like also when you're not used to managing people and when you're not used to picking up on maybe like some like emotional cues, it made it like definitely even more difficult before you even add the cultural layer. And so I think a big way though of like fostering that environment is being comfortable enough to share like what's a little bit of like what's going on with you personally as well, and so trying to facilitate it that way. And so we have like a little fun activity that I think we still do, which was like on Fridays it was let's ask a question that's unwork related as a big icebreaker to everybody in the team. And it would be things like, all right, what was your first job? Or like, what would be, last photo on your camera roll that you could
Yeah.
share with us? So things like that, that definitely I think really surprised people when they would like, be able to share like this different side of themselves or like recommend a podcast or a book. And so it felt a little bit sterile to do it as like a question on a big team meeting.
Yeah.
But I found it really interesting because it would foster a lot of like follow up and a lot of that interaction that you lose out on. And when you can have those sorts of like interactions about the things that you're doing outside of work, it becomes easier to talk about kind of like having those check-ins
Yeah.
and what's going on.
And a big lesson in the cultural differences and how we have to deal with people depending on their cultural background, which probably you learned about when you were growing up too.
Yeah, definitely. Yes. Yes. I mean, I think day one always would be like the cultural backgrounds would be even like, your name the first day of school, um, which was always a big one on like how is that pronounced? And so, and you just kind of learn how to operate, I think, in these various environments, which is a good skill to have. But I think a lot of that comes from like just listening to other people's stories more than um you having to be like either like the dominant culture or the dominant voice in a conversation.
And I think it develops cultural sensitivities to
Yeah.
others, right? So when we talk about, and I'm just jumping to sustainable development here because currently that's what you're doing. What is it that you look for, and what is it about sustainable development that you went, that's what I want to be spending my life investing in?
Yeah.
There's so many
Um,
ways and paths that you can take.
I think there are, yeah, you can look at, and I think I've looked at other definitely like sectors before, and I'm still interested in a lot of other sectors, but it's kind of like this is really the most important thing because it's looking at needs of where we sit today as a society, um, which I think are there's a lot of like short-termism and like the way that people think about their needs, particularly when you look at like a lot of the softwares that have been or innovations that have happened in the past like 20 years. And I think specifically about the space that I used to sit in being fintech. But you also think about like you don't want to compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And for me, it's really exciting because it hits on like there's a social element which I think is really interesting because you have to think about like inclusivity, building an equitable future for people, health. There's the social justice element. There's like human rights and labor rights. Then there's like education and healthcare, right? And community development, right? You think about the retirement problem that the world faces today, and I think in particularly in the US because that's been dominating the news cycle for the past week here. And so I think that's really exciting, right? And that's one pillar. And then there's the obvious environmental pillar, which, you know, I spent some time working in energy business in Africa and it was doing oil and gas, right? And so you could firsthand see, and we kind of had an approach to that market that was like sustainable first, which I think was really unique because like the world that we live in today, you're not going to go from a low base of renewable energy resources overnight to, you know, 100% renewable energy. There's like a transition that has to happen. And so um, going in there and leading with a sustainable mindset was really important. And you would see also firsthand kind of what has happened to ecosystems and biodiversity as a result. And then there are, you know, there's renewable energy, but then there's also things like water, right? And obviously a lot of people are, you know, there's greenhouse gas emissions, which has a big focus on it right now. And then there's food and agriculture, right? Like, how are we going to continue to feed ourselves, particularly as like climate change changes, like, you know, some agricultural patterns and obviously going back to water. So I think like that's really interesting. And then the last bit is obviously like economics and like economic sustainability, which I think links into the previous two. And it's like, how do you create long-term value while minimizing the negative impacts on environment and the society? Right? And so you think about things like ethical business conduct and yes, like sustainable investment strategies and you that balance which I think is really interesting, but between like the balance between profitability and social and environmental responsibilities. And so for me, it's like the most exciting problem to be looking at because it's not one specific problem. And there's both policy measures that can be used to solve it as well as like technology measures. And that makes it like really interesting. I think you can never be bored when you look at a field like that. And it's like I said, it's kind of looking at like the future of society. And I think that's, you know, integral and everyone's working on that in some way, shape, or form. It just depends on which one of these you look at specifically.
Yeah. And so you work with scientists, right? And how do you find these scientists developing these products or innovations?
Yeah, so a lot of it is through like research, like keeping on like the edge of what's happening from a research perspective and where grant money is going, for example, right? So if grants are funding some exciting new development, it's kind of keeping track of like, well, what are like the latest product designs or materials designs that the government is really interested in because like that's not today going to get funding from the private sector, right? So it's looking at that, and then it's also like speaking with people, researchers and universities who are, you know, who run labs on specifically on that type of research and technology, and it's quite interesting because you got to speak to various stakeholders, and then you can kind of also couple that with seeing how business leaders are thinking about not only sustainability, but how they're like future proofing their businesses. And so I think between all of those, there's a way to like triangulate what is like the most exciting bit of the field to be looking at.
And you're curious anyway, so it would be
Yeah.
interesting to uncover these unfunded inventions or ideas, innovations. And now, do you ever go outside of the US to look for these things?
So I haven't yet, obviously, even though I've spent a lot of time in Europe. I did previously kind of have a experience in Southeast Asia looking at like sustainable development innovations. And that was a result of research I got to do there while I was in university. And I think there's a like the other really interesting thing about sustainability is like it's a global problem we face, but there's that saying of like think globally, act locally. And so there are also, I think, really interesting innovations happening on a local basis, depending on the region, right? Because the problems that, you know, a country like Chad faces are like significantly different than the sustainability problems that like Denmark faces, right? And so I think it's interesting to kind of look at those differences, but some of the technologies I think are applicable across all markets.
And would you say that every country would have sort of a similar interest in sustainable development, or not at all?
It's so interesting. I don't like I I think that people often like to talk about incentives when it comes to let's take like the big thing, right, is like carbon emissions, right? And like this 1.5 degree, you know, Celsius increase scenario, which we've already missed. And so I think people like to talk about the fact that, yeah, like it's really easy for Western countries that are already developed to talk about reducing emissions, whereas like India and China and some other countries like that are less on that development curve, right? Or like they haven't gone through the full cycle yet are, you know, they need that to sustain their growth. And look at what like the UK was doing in like the 1800s and look at what the US was doing in the 1900s. So like if you almost ask all of these guys to reduce their carbon emissions now, they'll stagnate on like the development economic development curve as a country. And so I think that's that's a talking point that we hear a lot in this field when people talk about how like all of these different countries have different vested interests um in how it plays forward. But I think a lot of that rhetoric is starting to go away because people are recognizing the gravity of the issue, and that's specific to kind of, you know, to greenhouse gas emissions, but that can apply across various ways, right? So like the food and agriculture problem will also be very different depending on where you sit in the world. So it's just about incentives.
100%.
And
And how is technology playing into, I mean, more so in other areas, maybe underdeveloped areas, technology and sustainable development, or
oh wow. Yeah, so technology has been huge, I think, in this space. I think again, like just going back to the greenhouse gas example is like a big technology push that we've seen is something like, you know, carbon capture, right? Carbon capture technology. And there's so many within that, there's, you know, there's direct air capture, which has been pretty dominant, which is, you know, you capture CO2 directly from the atmosphere. And it could be particularly useful where like emissions are difficult to capture from a specific point source. And that is something that's gotten a lot of like funding and excitement recently. And then even like within direct air capture, there's innovations that are happening specifically on the technology that is used to make sure that like when you're capturing CO2 from ambient air, it's like you it's being stored properly, or like the technology and the metals that are being used are the right ones. And I'm like not a scientist, so I don't want to like go deeper into it than that because I don't really know exactly where the latest innovation is in that space, other than like they're now making innovations on the initial innovations. And then there's things like, you know, biological carbon capture or like mineralization. And so it's interesting to see how much technology there is being solved, like used to solve these problems. And I think a big thing that like is important to also think about is there's this concept of like a technology readiness level. And so there's some things that when you like look to invest in them, there might still be like too much science or technology risk, which means like it might just not be developed far along enough to actually be commercial and in a wide scale applicable. So it's like also finding the balance between, well, what technologies are really cool from a scientific perspective and which ones can actually be applied to the real world. And I think that's where like a lot of this balance exists. And as you like look through the various technologies, it's interesting to think about, because you're learning a lot and you're getting really excited about science. Then you're like, okay, that's, but that can only work in a lab setting today.
Yeah. And, it begs the question. I couldn't stop thinking about when you said this carbon capture from the air. It's like, okay, what do they do with it? What do they do with that CO2 once they capture it? Like, what is
Yeah, it's so interesting because there's various like storage storage methods that people use, and then there's also this whole other technological innovation that's happening where people are like using that CO2 to create like sustainable air fuels or things like, cement, right? So like or people are looking to store it in various places. So it's really interesting to see. And I think um it's like looking and finding also what's like the best long-term carbon storage solution, right? Because you can, I don't know, like you can grow biomass, you could, depending on what you're using, there are various almost outputs that come from the capturing.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, it starts to blow my mind when you start thinking of down the line.
Yeah.
So great that we can capture CO2 and then we're storing it. Well, are we going to be a bunch of storage, or are we going to filter it and clean it? Are we going to use it for like, it's just, I mean, the possibilities are just, when you start thinking about what can happen, it just starts to
Yeah.
expand my mind.
One of the coolest things that I've seen, and this is like not a plug because my brother works there, but is they take rocks, and I'm gonna maybe butcher this, but they take rocks and they kind of strip it. It's like the mineralization process, and one of the outputs of it can actually be used for like EV batteries. And I think that's so cool because you're looking at like, and one of the big problems with EV batteries is like people talk about like the critical minerals that are used are a huge bottleneck. And there's also like mining issues with those, in that, the number of countries that have those critical minerals are very small, and they still maybe use, not the best labor for workforce to actually mine those minerals. And so it becomes very interesting to think about like all of the problems that you could solve. And this is like the result of somebody's like, PhD research, which I think is absolutely incredible.
Yeah. 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 That's a whole different debate,
Yeah,
EVs. So
exactly. Oh my God, yeah. Well, yeah, because you're in Canada, so
yeah.
we could talk about that for a very long, yeah,
Yeah.
it's
So interesting though, you brought up your brother, who's your younger brother, because you're
yes,
a middle child.
yes.
How do you think that affected your perspective? I
I feel
want
like I never need to describe it to people. I just say I'm a middle child and they go, that makes sense. Um, I think I think it just means you're constantly like the go between people. So you're not only like interpreting and kind of what one is saying and what the other is saying, but you're also pretty good at compromise. And so I think it's really important to kind of like think about, because I think for me it's been really important in kind of like the way that I operate and the way that I exist in the world is a lot of like listening to both sides of the story and then kind of like coming up with some sort of like compromise or solution. Um and it's interesting, just to kind of think about those things that happen when you're a kid kind of still impact the way you interact with people today.
and but Is that why you're an overachiever? Because
Probably. No, I don't think so. I don't
no?
think so. I think I like have my I don't um I don't think so, but I do think that like I have an older sister who's like very accomplished. But but I think it was a lot of like, well, she was doing that and like we kind of look alike, although she's like much taller than I am. And so I think when you go through the same schooling system, like the teachers, especially when we have the same teachers, make certain assumptions about you based off of having a sibling, which I think was really interesting because like we're actually not alike at all. And part of me wonders like how much of my personality has been based off of that. And I'm sure there's some study out there that says, yeah, maybe a little bit, but I think it's also like our family and parents work incredibly hard, and both of them are scientists, and my father works in private industry, and my mother's a educator. So I think that also instilled in us that you could do whatever you want as long as you are the best at it. And like we don't care. And I think that might have changed a little bit where now it's just like we want you to be happy,
Yeah,
but whatever that means. But I think that obviously had a huge influence on us choosing our career path as we kind of grew into adults.
yeah, yeah. And I think probably it's a family trait based on what you just said, but
Yeah,
definitely the universal communicator that you are in being culturally sensitive to other people and, their upbringing and kind of when you were in the UK, I feel like that's definitely based firmly in middle child.
definitely. Definitely. Look, our family Thanksgivings, I always joke, like I think 10 years ago, our family dinner conversation or Thanksgiving conversation was like nuclear fusion versus fission. So it's never like a boring day. And then there's some politics involved. So it's like never a boring conversation. And if you're not able to like debate and keep up, it's you don't want to be there, I think.
Exactly. So the last question I'm going to ask you is one of those icebreakers that you talked about
Oh, cool.
when you were in UK. If you had your own late night talk show, who would be your first guest? Dead or alive, anybody in the world.
Oh, wow. That's a phenomenal question. Um, I have to say Nikola Tesla. And I feel like it's because obviously he obviously has this namesake company today, but he is a scientist who I think failed a couple of times, more than a couple of times. And what's really interesting is he has this very interesting arc of like interacting with some very famous US innovators and not really ever being given his full like due and respect from them, and not getting like the right economic rights to kind of what his inventions ended up being. So like we obviously know who he is today, but I think it would be really interesting if you could interview him in a modern context and say like this is everything. Like I know you might have not seen the economic outcome in your lifetime that you had desired, and other people might have benefited off of it, but like look at what society has become as a result of your innovation. Like kind of, do you regret it? Would you go back and do things differently? And I think you could have a really interesting conversation. And obviously brilliant scientist, and I think it's really interesting to think about people who were innovating. I mean, always people who are innovating, but innovating particularly at that time, and looking at like this space of electricity, kind of which is all
Yeah.
around us today.
Yeah. It's all about perspective, right?
Yeah.
So the
And he's an
perspective
immigrant,
of
anyway, right? He's not American. So it would be a really interesting conversation.
yeah, yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you, Yassy. It's been fascinating. And
Awesome.
we will be hearing more from you very soon.
Thank you. Well, yeah, hopefully this is like I'm going to use your question from now on for every icebreaker.